Welcome, everybody. Welcome, LC members. Welcome to the guests and first-time LC meeting attendees. It's great to have you here. For those that are just joining, I'm Amanda Brown. I'm Executive Vice President here at Convergence. As you log on, please use the chat to let us know where you're zooming in from. I know we've got folks joining from all across the country, and we'd love to see your name and location, and maybe how many inches of snow you might have, if that's relevant for your neighborhood. A couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording the session, as you can see. We don't have formal breaks built into the agenda since we won't be together for that long. So please do, of course, take a break whenever you need to. As far as beverages and snacks go that you may be used to finding at our LC meetings, please feel free to help yourself to anything you can find in your own refrigerator. We have,
everybody was laughing, Amanda. It's just that they were on mute.
I'm sure that's right. Thank you. Thank you, David. I know we're expecting over 100 people for this session. And with such a large group, we're going to depend heavily on the chat for our interaction, along with several breakout sessions. So you'll have a chance to chat, to also speak live in small groups. But we'll use the chat much more than we're able to use raise hands in this portion of our meeting. So please keep an eye on the chat. We'll communicate with you there throughout the program. We encourage you to communicate with each other there as well. So as we settle into our time together after several recent weeks that have been very stressful, made stressful by world events, domestic politics, the global pandemic, and for some of us this week, even the weather, we're in a moment where I think all of us could use a deep breath. We're very fortunate to have our own Jessica Dibb, who's world renowned for her breath work, teaching and leading. Jessica, would you guide us in taking a deep breath together?
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody. As we join to work together on behalf of creating a collective life that all of humanity can relish, let's put the oxygen mask on ourselves first. I invite you to close your eyes.
Jessica, you've fallen into mute.
My apologies. I'm not sure why that happened. Thank you. I'll just say, start again, take 1 minute. Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everyone. As we join together to work on behalf of creating a collective life that all of humanity can relish, let us put the oxygen mask on ourselves first and invite ourselves to close our eyes and feel the simple pleasure and value of being able to breathe freely. And let us take a breath with all the people that Convergence will ever serve, past, present, and future, for good health. And another deep breath for equity and freedom and human rights. And another deep breath for a sustainable life on our planet that supports well-being. And now let us begin our work together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think that was exactly what we needed. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that we now have two groups of people in the room with us in the Zoom room. Almost half of us came to our LC members only discussion and have been together now for already an hour. And the other half have just joined for our general session of the Leadership Council, and we are so pleased that you're here. We have a rich and full agenda this afternoon, which is linked in the chat. It consists of two discussions, both of which are very important and timely given this moment in our country. We'll start in a minute with a discussion between our CEO, David Eisner, and CEO of Bridge USA, Manu Miel, about how our bridge building work connects with the moment, or moments, there have been several lately, that this country is experiencing. And then secondly, will be a discussion of our economic recovery dialogue between our Senior Director of Programs, Russell Crumnow, and one of our key participant stakeholders in that dialogue, Rachel Lipson. A special thank you to our special guests, Manu and Rachel, for joining us today. David, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks so much to everyone for joining. What a, when I started at Convergence, one of the things that I heard from many staff was how extraordinary it is to be able to look out during our leadership council meeting and feel and see the support from so many leaders in so many spaces. And I had no idea how right he was. I really appreciate all of your being along with us on this journey. Before my discussion with Manu, I want to talk a little bit about this moment that we're in. Since we last met, as you heard from Amanda, we've had so much happen. We had the Capitol riots. We had on the same day, the vote certifying the election. We had the inauguration of a new president who's running really fast to focus on undoing a lot of what he sees that Trump did wrong. And we see the same president highly focused on bringing Americans together and speaking about a unity agenda. Although exactly what that means and how it will touch down programmatically, we don't really know at this point. It's also it's an extraordinary moment for Convergence. We see this massive and growing wave of public attention to what I think of as sort of both pieces of our work. One piece of the work is bringing people, especially leaders, together across their divides. And the other piece of the work is doing that to find elusive solutions to really critical challenges that we face. And what's also happened is that the battle has been joined by a number of folks who do not see bridging across differences as a very high priority, which in many ways means that the very ethos of Convergence, this idea that we can get our collective work done better, and in many ways we can only get our collective work done by coming together across our businesses, that's the conversation. You'll remember, though, that for the past couple of leadership council meetings, we've actually been anticipating this powerful public wave of attention. So we've become prepared. And I just want to share some things that we're probably not going to get into in this meeting so that you understand the energy and the force that we're bringing into this work in 2021. So first of all, thanks to so many of you who helped with this. We actually succeeded in a very difficult 2020 to come into 2021 with good financial resources. We also continued to strengthen what I think of as our track record of success. Not only with our new dialogues, but a lot of our past dialogues have been driving new impacts. And a great example of that comes from California, where the California Health Reform Initiative recommendation is now included in the governor's budget. And we're anticipating introduction in legislation. We've built very strong momentum in our dialogue on guns and suicide prevention, bringing what you could think of as sort of archetypal opponents who see themselves as enemies into a space, and they're building trust. We've built strong momentum too around economic recovery and America's workers, which is closing out this month, and you're going to hear a lot more about that very soon from Russell. And we're also, another area where we've built our capacity is we're really expanding our work on Capitol Hill at this important time. And we're supporting a lot of collaborative work across what we think of as an emerging field, the field of bridge building organizations. I mentioned, I'd love for folks to check out the podcast that Rob Firsch and Kelly Johnston recently had published, and I hope in the chat you'll be able to see a link to that, as well as to the great op-ed that spurred it, showing how people can come together around these issues from opposite poles. And I also want to let you know about my own op-ed that was in Real Clear Politics this week. So let's jump into, and I can't wait I'd like to introduce you to Manu Miel, who is the CEO of Bridge USA. And Bridge USA is a colleague organization for convergence that focuses on bridging differences among student communities on college campuses. And just in the last several days, I've heard from so many people about the need for us to be engaging young people. I feel like it was very fortuitous that we asked Manu to join quite a while ago. I'm especially excited to hear and to talk with Manu about one of the issues that we've talked about on this Leadership Council for some time, which is how do we drive greater diversity into the field of bridge building and onto our council. Manu, you've taken on a leadership role, I would say, across the field of organizations that we're talking about, and you've particularly focused your leadership in helping us expand diversity. You've brought you bring special capacity for the diversity in relation to age, especially focusing on engaging youth. And you're also helping with thinking about engaging more ideological and political diversity, especially in the conservative space, and racial diversity. So, and then Manu, before asking you a question, I'll also note that you've been a leader more broadly in the coalition. You're taking on, you're partnering with me and leading a work group on strategic communications, where we're reaching out to gatekeeper audiences like media and funders to build a collective voice from the field. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, Manu, is I'm going to make this more of a conversation, try to make it less of a panel. And everyone's welcome to put questions in the chat, and hopefully Manu and I will get to some of them. And the ones that we don't get to, we'll try to follow up with. So thanks so much for joining us. And why don't you start off, jump in by telling us a little bit about yourself and about Bridge USA.
Thank you, David, for having me. Thank you to the group. Just to demonstrate how honored I feel, I haven't worn a real shirt on a Zoom call, I think in over a year and a half. I graduated, I think, like in a tank top, because everyone was just screens off last May. So I just want to say that it is truly a privilege to be able to share my perspective, to discuss with you and sort of tackle a lot of these important questions. It's, forgive me for not using formal language, but it's a crazy time. And especially to be a younger person in that moment. For those that don't know me, and it's wonderful to meet a lot of the folks that I haven't met before, and I want to give a special shout out to John Steiner, who I saw in the audience. I have gallery view on, and John Steiner has been someone that's just been absolutely helpful. I, along with an amazing group of friends, had created Bridge USA back in 2017. That's when I was a freshman. And I specifically went to school at UC Berkeley, which, as you know, has been sort of at the nexus of a lot of these political issues. And at that time, there were these huge riots focused on free speech. And it was really an awakening for me, because at that time I was like, I want to go either be a doctor or go into venture capital. And when you see politics hit home, and you quickly realize that if society is not stable in a political sense, nothing else is stable, that we're highly interdependent in our different spheres, it really makes you beg the question, what are we doing and what's our purpose? And so I helped shepherd Bridge along with an amazing team of some of my best friends that were absolutely crucial to developing this concept. And the best way that I describe Bridge is that our belief is that the fundamental unit of democracy is people. People, us. We're the ones that vote at the ballot box. We're the ones that drive things forward. In this highly technological world, we forget that we are the units, the users, the citizens, the voters. And so our job is to make people more empathetic, more constructive, and more solution-oriented. And I think it's especially important with young people. And so basically what Bridge does is we essentially create, if you think about a city, you have green spaces. We're creating civic spaces on college campuses that are student-led, led by students for students, for the sole purpose of having conversations about issues that affect their community. So again, thank you so much, David, and thank you to the team and everyone else that is here. And I hope to learn something from you all, because I know that lectures are really boring. So please feel free to participate and ask any questions.
Thank you. Let me start off with a question that I think a lot of folks on the Leadership Council and our board may be asking of me. Why is it so important for you to be connected and working with this coalition of the field, that you're actually taking time away from your work as CEO of Bridge USA? What makes that field work so compelling?
Because we don't have another choice. Where there's not one organization that is going to solve the problem that we see. There's not going to be a set of a group of people. It's going to have to be a team effort. And importantly, what the field is blessed with is tremendous capacity. There's, I think, over 100 organizations focused on bridge building. That's a huge asset. And I want to do everything I can to bring what I call amateur aspirational thinking to this process, where there's wonderful, smart, engaged leaders, and think and challenge different conceptions, challenge sort of the bounds, challenge the limits that we may have artificially placed on ourselves, and think about specifically how we engage younger students in this broader movement. Because what I see bridge building as is a movement, and a movement consists of many parts and pieces. And my small role in this giant puzzle is that you've got a generation of young people, generation of citizens that are not thinking necessarily in the ways that we would like them to be thinking. And that presents a huge risk for the future of democracy, because no matter how much we change society in the status quo, if the next generation of leaders are apathetic and pessimistic, we're going to have some problems.
Let me jump right into the sort of the most thorny piece of this, diversity. And I'll note that in the last couple of meetings, we ended up raising diversity toward the end of a discussion. So it didn't get its full attention. So I want to start with it. Would you share why you think diversity is so important for us to very highly prioritize right now? What's missing in terms of our field? And why does that, or does that present a really specific challenge in terms of our impact?
So I think there's two things here. I think first is, and this has been a challenge on my part as well, is actually recognizing and exercising a degree of what I call strategic empathy, which is not perceiving the world or our team or whatever sort of our metric is in sort of this fantasy light, but actually recognizing the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation, what strategic empathy calls for, the reality of the situation is that our country has people that come from all walks of life, that look very different from each other, and aspire for various different outcomes. That's the reality of the situation. There's not this other reality where there's only these types of people that live in the United States or these types of people that live in the United States. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if that's the reality, what kind of society do we want to live in that helps accommodate everyone and helps everyone feel like they have an equal voice? Because that's the bedrock of our democracy. And given those two facts, I've always looked at diversity not as what it's cast in the mainstream as quote unquote a liberal value, but I think it is a core societal value. It absolutely is essential to whether or not our initiatives are going to succeed in the long run. back when I was in college and I was still like a nerd about political science things, and I was a quote unquote scientist, we looked at social movements that succeeded. This isn't just wishful thinking. We looked at social movements that have succeeded historically. And the social movements that failed were movements that were focused on a great mission, but did not incorporate different elements of our republic. Bridge building, the very definition of bridge building is we build bridges between people. And if the reality is that people look different than each other, then we've got to have all those different types of people involved in the conversation. So to me, it's not a controversial issue, it's a strategic issue. The last point I would just say, David, on this is that we can't view diversity just the same way, for example, you look at your budget. Our budget is core to our operations. It's not some like side initiative, because if we don't have the money, we can't exist. The same way diversity has got to be a core initiative. It's not some side project that I think we can tap into. We have to view it strategically as core to our success. And the last point I want to make here, and I know I said the last point was the last point, but this really, for me, hits at home, is that a lot of the pushback we've gotten, especially as we talk to folks that may not perceive the reality and the necessity of this, is, oh, it's part of the moment. It's the cultural calling. It's what sort of we have to do so that we can sell a better product or appeal to more people. And the question that I ask back at them is that if your strategy, let's say in your business world or in the bridge building field, for example, if our strategy is to reach the most amount of people from a purely strategic sense, what's the best way to do that? So I don't think it has to be this forced initiative that we take on. It's like, oh gosh, now we have to think about diversity. It's essential to our mission. It's essential to our operations, and we have to treat it and give it the respect that it deserves.
Thanks, Manu. We had a question in the chat that focuses on thinking about diversity, not just about race, religion, ethnicity, gender, but also diversity of thought. With that in mind, as you're leading the field working group on diversity, are there specific things that you want to try to make sure we get done, or the places that we focus?
Yeah, I think the first part of it is getting a agreed upon definition of what diversity actually means to us, right? So figuring out what that means, because I don't think we're all on the same page about, what is the value and what it means. So first, defining the term. The second part of it is identifying where the gaps are in our field. But the third part is not now viewing those gaps as, oh, we just got to fill these gaps because we got to fill these gaps. It's because those gaps are what are preventing our field from entering the mainstream narrative. It's what are preventing us from actually bursting past the bubble of quote unquote bridge builders. And that, again, mindset shift is so necessary in how we craft our messaging. It's also so necessary in how we actually approach those conversations, because it's not that we're just doing outreach to people, it's that we're including people. It's not that we're just tagging some folks to enter the conversation so we check a box. It's so that we have a better understanding of how we make an impact. And I know that someone put in the chat just now that if I could speak more about the power of youth in this generation. I don't know if that's a specific question you've got, but one point that I wanted to say about diversity is that I don't represent every aspect of the diversity concept, because I think that it requires, again, a degree of strategic empathy. I don't necessarily know what a young person that's like my age, that's an African-American, I don't understand their perspective. I also don't understand what the perspective of, for example, a rural white conservative youth in Kansas. I don't, but what I do understand the perspective and what I can speak towards is specifically young people. And so that's the final core aspect of the diversity puzzle, is that we need to not necessarily identify and name one person or this X entity as the key force push for diversity. Our ultimate job of the field is if we can actually identify relevant people and stakeholders that are specifically representing groups to then actually do that work and empowering them rather than just investing the authority in one person, if that makes sense.
It does. We've had several questions around the impact of youth, from wanting to know more about the campuses that you're engaged with, how we make this more of a priority on campus, and as you mentioned, speaking more about the specific power of youth. Do you have a sense beyond diversity, beyond simply including the next generation, Do you think that youth has something very specifically to offer us in this moment when we're trying to figure out how Americans can better connect with each other, to understand each other?
Yeah, when it's a very good question because my answer changes every time I'm asked the question. And that's just me being honest. The reason why it changes every time is because it seems like the world flips upside down and then flips upside down again every time the question is asked. And so, but I think there's a couple of common themes that I've always at least grasped on just from my conversations. And one thing I want to make clear is that what I know is not sort of me, thinking about things in sort of a specific academic setting. It's something where I've actually tried to go to different campuses in various areas. Someone that messaged me said community colleges, understanding people of different levels, backgrounds, educational vocations, also recognizing the fact that only 49% of, I think that's the most recent stat, of each generation actually goes to college, or at least that's the case with Gen Z. So recognizing that I'm missing 51% of the youth when I bring this perspective. That being said, there are four major events that define the life of anyone that's from like the ages of 18 to, let's say, 25. And that's 9/11, the Great Recession, the 2016 election, and what I'm calling the hodgepodge year of 2020, which entails the pandemic, this election, and the Capitol riots. That is like our sample size of democracy, political events. That's it. And that shows that for most young people my age, the norm is a broken democracy. Now, that isn't all pessimism there. Again, it goes to that point of strategic empathy, recognizing that this is the reality of the situation. But that's okay, because every country goes through cycles of disruption. And out of those disruptions, there's great possibility for renewal and regrowth. But what that reality shows me is that most young people fall into two camps. And this is broad generalization, but this is what I've seen. The first camp is that, and by the way, I just saw the comment about the 2008 Obama election. It's a great point. If you go into rural places, if you go into rural white conservative community colleges, if you go into places like Alabama, Mississippi, and specifically look at those schools, the 2008 Obama election was the equivalent of the 2016 Trump election for many liberals. That's also a reality point that we have to grasp with. And it's not me creating a false equivalency. It's just what I've observed. Going back to sort of the point about what that implies for young people is that it creates a degree of apathy for many folks. But the more insidious trend that I've seen is that a lot of young people are resorting to what we call pessimistic politics. And what I mean by pessimistic politics is that if this current reality of the situation does not reflect sort of the boundless progress narrative that defines American history, right? And I'm not saying that that narrative doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that that's not what a lot of the evidence is demonstrating to a lot of students my age. That means that students are either thinking, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they are on, they're like, either the system has to radically change or we disengage. That's huge. That's a trend that we have to address. And we never think about our politics in the long run. We have to think about our politics in the long run. We can reform, modernize, increase voting turnout, but if the habit of civic and cultural engagement does not exist in the next generation of young people and citizens, I'm afraid that the polarization that we're seeing today is going to become more corrosive and salient. That's sort of the bad news. I'm happy to talk about the good news, but I know that I've answered this question for like at least 2 minutes.
But let me shift you for a second.
Please.
To talk about race. It's a really different challenge than other kinds of diversity. Issues around equity and power play deeply and resonantly, and we're also starting with such a deep history of prejudice. So how would you, just starting off with what you're hoping to do, how do you think we need to be focused on driving racial diversity and equity through this bridge building and problem solving work?
Sure, and this actually a little bit of my answer actually changed on this based on our conversation. One thing I want to say is I'm absolutely grateful to have David actually enter the field. And I'm really grateful for your leadership with both Convergence and the perspective that you bring. Because one of the things that I've seen with David and yourself specifically is you have this great ability to understand and accommodate different perspectives, provide space. And that is actually the first key step for racial diversity, in my opinion, is creating a space that isn't, again, focused on outreach, but inclusion. And so I think that you've got that right leadership. And that's what I've witnessed in my own sort of accommodations with other young people. That's the first step, is we have to have that leadership and mindset of space. And I think that you bring that to Convergence, and I'm grateful for that. The second part is that there's a generational shift in how a lot of younger people right now, Gen Z, is thinking about when they're graduating college. The cool thing like 10 years ago was you drop out of college and create this like cool startup that makes a bunch of money. Now the cool thing to do when you graduate college is to drop out, make a startup that makes no money. And point being is that there's a more higher degree of altruistic thinking in my generation. And so for a lot of us, it's not necessarily having this awakening about diversity, because our generation is, I think, the most diverse it's ever been in history. So we've had to understand that that's part of our interactions, but importantly, including it as a core value and initiative. The last point about racial diversity is that, again, I'm not the person that should be fully with that authority of reaching out to, for example, African-American groups or Latinx groups or Native American groups, because I don't have the same ability to empathize with them. It's not that I don't want to, and I'm sure that I could be a little bit effective, but finding a Native American leader that is really passionate about bridge building and empowering them will be far more effective. Again, concept, strategic empathy. It's not what I think is the most effective, but I think it's the reality, and I think that'll really help our field. That's my last point. I think that's something that I really want to stress with our field working group, is that my hope is that actually our diversity working group translates into actually finding a group of 4 to 5 people that are really passionate about bridge building, that represent specific communities that aren't represented by us, and then they actually take this work on. And what I can help with is the youth aspect, because I think it's incredibly important. And I think that those of us that aren't necessarily a part of that conversation, I think we got to just open up a little bit and have that mindset to accommodate, which you've got, and I'm grateful for it.
I can't believe that we've already gone 20 minutes and only have a couple left. Feel like we're just scratching the surface. Let me again switch directions on you, which is to ask more specifically, how would you articulate to really Convergence's extended leadership here why we're partnering now on a great initiative, or co-promoting a video. Convergence is an organization where we focus on bringing leaders together to focus on driving policy solutions. We have sort of this small footprint with a big outcome that's pretty different from Bridge USA. Why does it feel relevant to you to be partnering with Convergence?
It's a great question. There's 2 parts to this, I think. First is what is our Bridge USA's theory of change? And I think this is similar to your theory of change, is that you have to combine the grass tops, the quote unquote institutional experts. I think Convergence is operating at that institutional level with the grassroots. And when you have that, no pun intended, convergence of the 2 sort of sides of the equation, you can actually achieve something transformative. And we saw this at the university level, is say we empower a bunch of student leaders, they're really excited, they start going out there and getting excited about bridge building. But if you don't have the dean or the administration, or in our case, the congressional leaders, when you're talking about the bridge building space behind it, that grassroots element loses the power and the transformative impact it could have. Reverse that, if you've got the administration, they're passing some cool initiatives, but no student buy-in, aka no grassroots buy-in, it doesn't have the same saliency. And same with our work. I think that Convergence, on the second piece of it, is really effective on 3 levels, I think, with engaging the institutions and actually helping the bridge building field with its expertise. I think the first is that you're demonstrating proof that bridge building is actually possible, that it can have an impact within folks, demonstrating the ability for it to take place. The second part is that there's a clear and set methodology that you've developed and have identified that I think is something that a lot of people ought to learn from. And the third part of it is that there's a degree of expertise that you're bringing to the table, whether it is from your team. I know that, for example, our team, Amanda has been speaking with Omar on your team, who I got to meet today, and some of the other people that are on your staff. That expertise is wonderful, because the one thing that we have to be humble about at Bridge is that we're building the bridge as we run across it. I have no leadership coach, nor do I have any sort of expertise on whether it is fundraising or talking to members of Congress. So I'm truly grateful for the relationship, and I'm grateful for sort of what you all are doing.
And I'm grateful that you were able to join us, share some of those insights, and that you were willing to do it and be so open, even though it's a relatively short amount of time that we were able to speak. There's a bunch of questions that we've got that we didn't get to, and if it's okay with you, Manu, we're going to we'll follow up and see if we can pen some quick responses to some of the additional questions that came in. But in the meantime, I hope folks felt like this was a worthwhile moment of time. And again, I want to express, I'm learning as much from Manu as he's just articulated. He's learning from me. I'm definitely feeling like the recipient, and I think our whole field is really benefiting from both you and Bridge USA. So thank you.
And David, could I just say one quick thing? I know you guys are on a time clock, just 20 seconds. I totally recognize how difficult the bridge building work is right now. It seems like everything is falling apart. And I recognize, and I have these thoughts all the time as well, when I'm sitting in my room is, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right piece of work at this moment in time? And I keep coming back to the fact that there is no alternative. There is no other choice. And it is so important for you all to be engaged, and for all the leaders that are a lot older than me to be engaged, because we need the role models. So when you guys are having a hard time, and I know it happens within every organization, I know it happens with all of us, and oftentimes we're not open with those thoughts, know that it is so important, and that we're still working on a lot of these initiatives like diversity. We haven't figured it out, but I'm excited to sort of pursue it. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I'm going to quickly, only 2 minutes late, turn it over to Russell Crumnow, who has been so ably leading both our guns and suicide prevention convergence dialogue and the convergence dialogue on economic recovery and for America's workers. We're on the path toward closing out that economic recovery dialogue, and would love for Russell to be able to share some thoughts about that, especially with our guests. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Great to be with everybody. And thanks to Rachel Lipson, who is joining me for this next segment. She's been participating as a stakeholder in this economic recovery project. So we're about to jump into a little bit of a back and forth to give folks more of a sense of what we've been up to. A quick word of context for me. Again, I'm Russell Crumnow, the Senior Director on the staff. I oversee a lot of our programmatic work and have the fun challenge of taking this sort of high-minded idea of what convergence is about and trying to execute on it in the context of a specific issue through the dialogues that we lead. I want to thank a couple of folks who aren't getting airtime in the meeting. We have a very small team here, as I think many people know. So the heavy lifts of this work and building relationships and pushing the work forward is done by a very, very small number of people, with the support, of course, of many folks like those on today's call. Omar El-Khatib leads all of our work in Capitol Hill, who I have the pleasure of working with closely on that. And Erica Loken works closely with me on our project-based work, some of which you're about to hear about. So thanks to both of them. I'm smart on this. If I'm ever smart on this stuff, it's because they're smart on it and make me smart. So Rachel, moving into a discussion about this specific topic, as many of the folks on the call know, Convergence previously had a dialogue called Working Up that met starting in 2016 for a couple of years, of which Rachel was not a part. And we're thrilled she is now engaged with us in this sort of new iteration. the Working Out project was aimed at increasing economic mobility, especially for low and moderate income Americans. And it released a whole set of recommendations. And they were not just around public policy. They also included a whole bunch of ideas of what the private sector can do, higher education, community colleges, philanthropy, faith-based groups. And some of the value out of that original stakeholder table that tackled how to make work a better engine of upward mobility is that it not only had right and left-leaning voices, which are of course critical and true of all convergence dialogues, but it really did have sectoral diversity. A lot of people working in the opportunity space or in the anti-poverty space in the past have not always meaningfully included the voices of business, for example. And so there's a lot of us now working in the space, not just convergence, many others recognizing that's essential. The demand side perspective is really critical. And so we thought a real value out of our dialogue and of the work we've been doing more recently was to have a strong business voice and a really strong perspective from people outside of Washington on the ground doing this work that are really close to the lived experience of what do people actually need to have upward mobility? What are the interlocking challenges preventing that? What does it look like to juggle childcare, to juggle a long commute from where you can afford rent to where your job is actually located? All of the many interlocking challenges that make accessing ladders of upward mobility very difficult for some Americans, even as other people are obviously doing quite well. Given the economic fallout from the pandemic, we've decided, we had a notion to bring back together part of that dialogue group and add some new perspective, folks like Rachel who've joined us over the last 6 months or so. And this group's goal has not been to develop a whole new set of recommendations. We kind of did that a couple of years ago with the original report. We've pulled that forward. And frankly, the landscape has been very fast moving. Congress has done multiple relief bills, and there have been many, many wide-ranging and innovative things happening in communities across the country, led by businesses, led by churches, led by nonprofits, led by individual citizens to bolster people who are frankly losing their livelihoods and having a very difficult time given the huge economic fallout of the pandemic. So what we're going to do today is spend just a few minutes giving you a flavor of what those conversations have been in this economic recovery project over the last several months. And then we're going to look forward together and share with you, so where are we going? Because the goal of meeting the last several months with this reconstituted group, some of whom again participated before and some of whom have been new voices, the goal has been to share information, quickly vet good ideas, connect people who don't normally connect across right-left divides, but also, as I said, across sectoral divides, but also to issue spot and to figure out where could convergence more deeply work in 2021 on getting us out of this deep ditch. We know that the effort of economic recovery going forward, especially for people in low and moderate income work, or those who've lost jobs and now face long-term unemployment, we know that work is a long-term effort that requires everybody kind of rowing in the same direction. So we're trying to make some decisions now about a full-on economic recovery dialogue in 2021, and the effort the last several months has helped inform that and paint a bit of a picture about where we're going to go. So with that, I welcome in Rachel from Harvard's Workforce Project, a relatively new initiative that's brings together multiple schools at Harvard. We're thrilled to have Rachel on. She's also done a ton of work herself on these issues very directly, having done work with groups like Year Up and others that work with youth and young adults to help get them on education and career pathways, which is a big part of success on these issues. So Rachel, to start, thanks so much for your participation in the last several months in Convergence's economic recovery conversations. I wanted to ask you, what have you learned? What value has this set of conversations brought? And specifically, if you can share a little bit about the value of these sort of cross-sector perspectives coming at it from different angles, all being in one group that's been meeting in recent months and all over Zoom, obviously.
Yeah, Russell, thank you for having me today and also for having me over the last 6 months. I have to say that participating in this group has really been, in many ways, a breath of fresh air and a ray of light during what's been a really tough stretch for the country. And I find that jumping onto this Zoom room and kind of breaking down some of the traditional silos that exist and having people with fresh ideas who are ready to engage and ready to debate and ready to assume best intentions of each other. It's given me personally a lot of energy and a lot of hopefulness and optimism about the months that sit ahead. So I'm just grateful for having that opportunity to learn from others and kind of take that energy into my own work and how I think about what I want to apply from this pretty challenging time moving forward. I think one thing I'd say about these issues that we focus on in our economic recovery group is that it's a unique kind of space in that there has been some alignment for some years now that there is a problem, I would say. So there's not, there has been some level of common acknowledgement across parties and then across business, across policy, across educators, that creating more pathways into economic mobility is something that we need to do. Where we've kind of stalled has been a lot around like what's the right set of solutions. And what I think has been really unique about this moment, and where I see the dialogue has added so much value over the last 6 months, is just the sense of urgency related to this particular crisis. And the way in which it's exacerbated some of the long-running trends that we've seen and really brought them out into the open in a way that you can't ignore them anymore. So Russell, as you've referenced, the economic effects of the pandemic, as well as the public health effects, are disproportionately affecting low-wage workers, women, people of color. And I thought that the dialogue, rather than kind of skirting around those issues, there was like a real acknowledgement of what's going on right now is just unacceptable in a way that in the past, there wasn't that directness around acknowledgement of the problem. And that really kind of helped build some appetite towards how do we lift up some new voices? How do we create some kind of bias towards action? Where are some unfamiliar places that we might look for solutions? Whether that be at innovations at the state and local level or the role of the private sector. But I felt that the group really had, a sense of like, this isn't something we can ignore anymore. And how can we kind of work together to drive from some sort of common identification of a problem to a common set of solutions. So I found that overall kind of tone to the group extremely helpful and really derived a lot of energy from it in my own work.
Terrific. Thanks for all that, Rachel. And yeah, a couple of things you mentioned. We did find it, we knew coming into this set of conversations that racial equity would be front and center, but we actually had that independently confirmed by, as you said, everybody in the group naming it and thinking hard about the fact that job losses have been disproportionately falling on people of color, especially women of color, and thinking hard about what are all the barriers to reconnecting, not just to any job, but to a good job with mobility, caregiving responsibilities being a big one. And then your good point about innovation, just getting some people back to the same jobs they had a year ago, in some cases might be a win. They might be happy to get back to that same job. We know for some folks, there's a transition. There's an inflection point. Some industries will not come back in the same way. We've got a really creative think about digital learning, new skills, pathing people into jobs that they may not have had before, because that might be what's available in the region in which they live. And so to take people inside the conversation a little bit, we've really had two broad buckets of issues emerge that we focused on. I think both threaded through with a framing around equity, around race, and around thinking about making sure we don't want to have this sort of K-shaped recovery, which is essentially what's happening, right? Where some folks are bouncing back quickly and doing well, and we have some folks on another path that are facing a harder time. They're either underemployed or they're maybe facing longer term unemployment. And we know once people go past about 6 months without employment, actually 3 is pretty tough, but past about 6, you really start to have a harder time reconnecting. Your networks atrophy, and you look problematic to possible employers, which is unfortunate. And so the group's been thinking about 2 buckets. One is, how do we path those folks into good quality jobs? What are all the creative ways to do that? Subsidies, reskilling, that touches on things like digital access. There are many Americans in a country that's as wealthy as ours that don't have high-speed internet at home, and or don't have a device where they can access it, and or don't have the digital literacy to use it well. So that's a big barrier. That's a challenge. People also need good information, like, where can I get trained in 3 months to get a credential to earn a good job where I live? So the one bucket of challenges has been around skilling people and pathing them into high quality jobs. And then the second bucket, which is obviously bound up with that one, is what are all the benefits and supports that surround work that make a good job a good job. So for some people, that's support around childcare or paid leave. There are lots of others on that list, obviously, but those are a couple that the group named in particular. Many people face caregiving challenges, sometimes it's elder caregiving, sometimes it's with kids or something else in their life. But juggling all of that while they're trying to skill and train and get back into a job is enormously complex. So I'd love to hear you share a little bit about each of those buckets, and not just the challenge, which I've started to touch on, but where you're hopeful, where are there opportunities? Obviously, there's massive challenges with both, but what are some things we've talked about or some areas you're hopeful in the skilling and jobs pathway bucket, and then in the supports and kind of the childcare bucket?
Sure. I mean, first of all, Russell, you referenced that, obviously these two things match together. And I think that actually for me, it was a huge advantage of the dialogue over the last 6 months that we did link those two conversations. And I'd say kind of a difference from my day-to-day work for folks who work, I'm deep in the workforce development space and often can be stuck within the silos of people who are thinking all day and all night only about training or potentially, about interactions between education and employers and policymakers, but without as deep engagement on these kind of related and corresponding issues, whether it be childcare and job quality. And so I thought that actually the linkage of those two dialogues made a lot of sense and added a lot of depth and value to our conversations, because obviously, like, to the extent that we're living in a universe of finite resources and resource constraints, trying to only think about, one subset of these issues without the broader package of what are the implications on that, on the other pieces of life and wraparound supports that enable someone to actually get into a good job and then stay and maintain it and advance over time. So the linkage there of kind of the childcare work, and also we had a great discussion about unemployment insurance and kind of the relative strength or lack thereof of the social safety net, and what does it look like when people do suffer that shock in their life, what is standing to help support them as they make that transition, because we know that training and getting into a new career is something doesn't happen right away, and there's going to be an interim period, and it's a lot of different parts of society coming together to help support people, whether it be through the mental health implications of a job loss, of the community aspects of it. So anyway, I found like a lot of these thematic issues melded really nicely, and there was a really interesting kind of interplay happening from people who might focus particularly on childcare in their day-to-day work, adding really, really fresh perspective to a conversation about, workforce issues and career pathways.
Right.
In terms of some of the broad buckets of work and opportunities that, we aligned around, and there was a lot of momentum and energy, I think there was a lot of discussion about kind of how do we scale some of the successful innovations that have happened but have not reached kind of society at large and are particularly challenging at this moment. So that translated into discussions around kind of the intersection of the public higher education system, of our community college system, and some of these short-term private training efforts. What does it look like to have kind of integration of the best pieces of both into a sort of more holistic package of supports and responses in this moment on the skilling and pathways question? There was a lot of excitement about what it can look like, particularly in this moment of recession, to get more people experience and exposure to new types of career opportunities. So whether that be, how do we support more chances for work integrated learning, for more people to get exposure to new types of jobs? What can kind of non-traditional ways of financing that look like, or to get people just that first bit of experience that you need to successfully make a transition into a new role and a new occupation? On the childcare front, I thought there was a good amount of energy and frustration about the limits of our current system and the ways in which it's broken, and a lot of thoughts about sort of like the market constraints and what would solutions look like that could help us scale up more slots more quickly and some really real acknowledgments about like what would be the funding required to make that happen, and where are the different parts of society that could come from. With you know, I think some really good recognition from private sector colleagues in the group around like that the public sector alone wasn't necessarily going to be best positioned to foot the entirety of that bill, and that companies in this moment really recognizing a need to step up and create more opportunities for their employees to have care for their children and family members. So I also thought there was a lot of interesting directions that work can go, and I'm excited to see where the group comes out from here.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to flag for folks in a couple of minutes, we are going to spend some time in breakout discussion. So I want to, there's already some great comments coming in the chat and a lot of interesting ideas about innovations folks are already involved with regard to skilling and sort of new careers. So appreciate that from folks. And there is going to be time to hear from you in breakouts, and a bit in that feedback will filter back to us as Convergence seeks input and guidance on which of these kind of focus areas we're actually going to lean into with a more formal dialogue going forward. But Rachel, I want to ask you, what's the cost if we don't succeed at this, if we don't do a good job, if we don't have an equitable recovery? We can all disagree about what that would actually look like, but you know, if we fail at this and then maybe flip it around to a more assets or positive based framing and ask you like what's possible if we do it well and propel ourselves forward on these paths. So as the new administration is 2 weeks old and thinks about its role, and frankly all of us have a role to play, as I think we've emphasized with our group, this is not just about solving a policy puzzle. That's really important, but there's a whole bunch of innovative stuff. We've seen companies like Target roll out an interesting childcare benefit during the pandemic to help their employees, you know, juggle these issues. So there's a lot of things people can do. I know community colleges are right at the forefront of actively skilling folks who come from many non-traditional backgrounds. So there's a lot of actors involved. But what's the cost if we get this wrong, and what are the possibilities if we do a good job in the months ahead?
So, I mean, I don't mean to be dramatic here, but I mean, the stakes are quite high. And for many people in our country, it's literally a question of life or death right now. Right. So millions of people have lost their health care in the midst of a pandemic, which is what happens in our system when you lose your job. You know, those who have been less likely to be able to work from home and therefore have been at the front lines of the pandemic are more likely to be below the median income. They're more likely to be renters, to not be born in this country, to not have a college degree, to be non-white, to not have employer-sponsored healthcare. We know that for displaced workers, when you lose a job, your mortality, your likelihood of mortality in the year following goes up 50 to 100%. We know that when a parent loses their jobs, there's long run implications for their child's performance in school. When we know that when communities lose jobs, the research tells us, like, for example, when communities lost manufacturing employment, causal relationship with rising opioid use and deaths. So there's some really startling research about, and that's not even to touch on, you know, depression and mental health, or the health effects of the pandemic itself. So, I mean, so the stakes are actually like quite high of the people in this country who have lost their jobs or lost hours due to this crisis. And I think in the short run, we can't forget about them. I do want to take this moment, and I think the aspirations towards what can we learn for this to create a more equitable ladder to opportunity moving forward is really important. But there's also like this near-term, like very urgent issue of the folks who have lost their jobs right now. And what we saw in the Great Recession is that those effects persist, you know, often for decades. If you lose a job, your earnings, you can see 20-year effects on your earnings from that job loss that you never catch up. And the longer that you're out of work, the longer, the less likely it is that you're going to return. So So anyway, I mean, all that's to say is, what's the cost if we don't do this well? I think it's a really, really high human cost, not even to mention the kind of political cost about the trust in our system and the adequacy of our response and our ability to deal with a crisis, and to create opportunities for people to, you know, to work and to take home money for their families, to take care of their families. All of that, I think, is up in the air right now. And so how we respond is really going to matter for folks' belief in the system and our ability, you know, to keep people alive. So that's a little bit of a depressing angle. I do think, you know, there to our earlier comments about the opportunity for a cross-sector and cross-partisan solutions right now. Again, you know, the Band-Aid has been ripped off. Our wounds are out there for society. And I think there is a lot of recognition that these problems are so big that they're not going to be solved by one sector alone. If you ask workers themselves, you know, what are the challenges that you're facing right now when it comes to getting reemployed or for preparing for the future of work more broadly? They cite a lot of things, and the solutions, you know, span a bunch of these different stakeholders and actors. You know, folks aren't actually sure which programs they want to enroll in. So that hints at the need for the education sector to play a role at kind of helping with navigational guidance and creating these pathways. Folks talk about costs. That's not going to be necessarily solved by public policy alone. There's certainly a role for business in there as well, and for the education system at large. They also talk about, how do I find the time to retrain? And that's a question not just of an individual, but whether your employer supports you in accessing retraining, or if there's opportunities in your local community for you to access it. So I think that there's a moment right now where there's recognition that we have a huge problem. There's a recognition that you know, different sectors have a role to play in addressing it. And I do think that one of the things that was most exciting that I heard from this group is that there were some unifying themes around this idea that there is no denying that, like, technology and this current shock has altered and shaped and changed the way that we work, the opportunities that are available in the economy, and pretty broad consensus that, you know, perhaps the education and training system hasn't moved fast enough to adapt, and, you know, perhaps was designed for an earlier era. And
Right.
And in that way, I think because there's really an opportunity through exposing how much has been broken for looking at things that people thought were previously off limits, or to really starting from kind of a blank slate and thinking about, okay, if we were going to build a new system that connects education and career and jobs, or creates opportunity for more people, what would it look like? We see in this moment that some of the traditional rules around, whether it be around online delivery of curriculum, or changing the rules around work requirements through some of our public programs, or raising the wages of frontline workers, or direct stimulus payments. We're actually seeing a lot of real life experimentation right now, and things that, you know, a year ago people never would have thought were possible or would happen. And I do think it's shifting the dialogue in a major way. So there's the opportunity potentially to do something big and make some big investments, and not just prop up like a rickety existing system, but experiment with new things and see what we can learn moving forward, because the status quo, you know, just so clearly isn't sufficient.
Yeah, fantastic. Rachel, thank you so much. I hope this gave people at least a very broad sense of the landscape. In just a few minutes here, it's hard to do these big, complicated issues justice, but we are about to go into breakouts. And the question for folks will be, you know, based on what you're seeing, you all are plugged in to the national conversation, but also you're plugged into your own community. The question is where you hope the next stage of this discussion goes in a way that's most helpful to America's workers as we decide internally about where a deeper, more structured dialogue might focus on that basket of issues around pathing people into jobs, or perhaps around some of the benefits and supports. We welcome folks to weigh in, but not just on that binary choice. We actually would love a rich discussion in your breakouts around what you're seeing and what you think the dialogue should focus on. Very briefly, I'll mention, somebody asked a good question in the chat, like, how do you know if you've been successful? There are a lot of ways for convergence dialogues to have impact. Sometimes we practically can see that a private sector company at our table went and did a XYZ thing, and it changed the lives of their workforce. That happened with the original Working Up dialogue with Walmart, which was a fulsome participant and did a whole bunch of things to expand the opportunity agenda internally for the biggest private sector workforce in the country. So sometimes there are things like that. But the other impacts of the project are sometimes harder to describe, but are knitting together groups that have never worked together. There have been people in this conversation in the last several months who did not know each other before at all, and now have an organic relationship kind of offline outside of our group. And they're talking about how to make unemployment insurance better. They're talking about a child allowance, which some folks might have seen that Senator Romney released a Republican proposal today for a child benefit that is a little different, but not that far off from President Biden's proposal. So there's actually some really exciting policy stuff in the mix coming from the right and the left on ways to bolster families and empower them, as well as the range of things going on in the private sector. So with that, why don't we go into our small groups? Rachel, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us this really broad overview, given your deep expertise. We're grateful for you and for your participation in the group. And now we're gonna let everybody have some deeper conversation about what you heard and what you think convergence would be smart to focus on going forward. And after we come back on the backside of those breakouts, we'll let a couple of people share something compelling you heard in your small group conversation. Thanks everybody so much. We'll see you soon. Everybody, welcome back. Thanks for engaging in that discussion. I know we were having a really good discussion in our room that, in fact, the final insightful comment was like cut off as we were pulled back in. So thanks everybody. We just have a quick heartbeat here to maybe let a couple of folks, if you want to use the raise hand function to help us identify you, please don't feel the need to like summarize everything that was said, but share with us a notion or a compelling idea that you heard in your breakout that you're going to be ruminating on, that you think the full group would benefit from hearing. We'd love to hear from a couple of people. So if anybody wants to use the raise hand, and you can chime in and share something interesting that was shared in your breakout on the big, crazy, interesting, important world of economic recovery. I'll share a comment in my group and then I'll call on Tom, that folks were saying, you know, there are some industries where we have a sense of where they're going to be going in the months ahead, but for some, it's a real guessing game. We're going to have to really reinvent ourselves. And that makes it very difficult to plan and to know what to fund and what to focus on, because for some industries, they're going to look very different or perhaps not bounce back in the same way. Tom Dunn, go ahead. If you want to unmute yourself and.
Yeah, in a way, am I unmuted now?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. It kind of relates to what you were saying, Russ. I was really surprised about in the discussion about how the current situation, COVID situation, is already changing and will change in unknown ways. Not only jobs, but actual what cities look like. I mean, and that kind of puts people who are scratching their heads over all this at a really, you know, it's like, what's the future going to hold? You know, where's your crystal ball? This is a tough one.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, Simon, go ahead.
Well, we did talk about how cities might change, and I just want to add another thought. We had that sometimes it's hard to predict. And I'd mentioned before, we look at past black swan events, and during the event, we don't make good predictions of what it looks like 5 years after the event. So I'm circumspect, thinking half the offices will be empty in 5 years. I'm not sure. We have to see things develop more.
Right. None of us wants to be overconfident that we have it all figured out. Great comments in the chat. We welcome them there as well. I see David Eisner summarizing a point from his group that economic mobility continues to be an important theme, right? So what does a quality job that can help you move up and build wealth look like with the rapidly changing world of tech and the jobs that are available to different types of people. Anybody else want to chime in? Maybe one final comment if anybody wants to unmute and share a thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Russ, at the risk of being repetitive, as Sonny said in the chat, this question about economic mobility and re-strengthening people's roles in the economy has got enormous breadth. There are so many sub-aspects to it. And I guess I would urge upon you and the team to really try to narrow down what the next area of dialogue is going to be. And I think this is a general principle, I think, in terms of any of Convergence's dialogues. We've been talking about trying to have diversity around the table of any dialogue. And of course, that's a value all of us cherish. But the question about how do you define that diversity is going to very much be dependent on how you're honing into a specific question. And I would think with respect to this economic dialogue, it's even more significant because there's so many different facets to it. Are you going to talk about childcare? Are we going to talk about minimum wage? Are we going to talk about which industries are going to thrive and where? We literally can list dozens upon dozens. And it seems to me if there's a little work done first to say, here is the precise question we are going to predominantly focus on, then I think you can have an easier time figuring out what kind of diversity you need around the table to address that.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ron. We're going to put a poll up on the screen that's partly in service of what you just said. Now, the two areas you're going to see to choose between in the poll are themselves still very, very broad. So we have a lot more narrowing to do within either one. But we're curious to have folks react to this poll that basically lets you choose if you think Convergence should lean a little bit more toward the pathways and the skilling conversation, or a little bit more to the supports like childcare and paid leave. Feel free to just pick one of those quickly, recognizing you probably think they're both worthwhile and you probably think they're both still way too broad. We hear that loud and clear. I'm seeing some really good comments in the chat about infrastructure. And so I think there's a good chance that we will lean into a conversation about infrastructure and how it could be a pathway to some of these quality jobs, and in the broadest sense, meaning broadband access and other pieces like that, in addition to sort of traditional transit and roads and such. And so we can go ahead and put once we get some responses, if somebody wants to put the results up on screen, feel free to share those with us. All right, interesting. So a decent lead there for the skilling and pathways conversation, although not a blowout. So unsurprising that folks are interested in both. Well, thank you so much for engaging in that discussion. I know there's a lot more we could say. Many of you have a lot of ideas you're continuing to share in the chat. We're going to read all of those. And I personally look forward, as I am in the churn right now of trying to figure out and listen to lots of smart people who don't all agree on where this dialogue should go. I also, am going to take those comments under advisement and welcome your good ideas. I'm going to very, very briefly mention, completely shifting gears, another dialogue I am also leading at Convergence right now, just to let you know that it's still going. We've shared about it in past Leadership Council meetings and likely we'll focus more on it in the future, but we just wanted to put a pin and make sure people know there's a group of stakeholders meeting right now. You got a written update about this in your materials, focused on firearms and preventing firearm suicide. So that is Convergence's entry point into the guns conversation that many of you have asked us for years to tackle. We did a very thoughtful and long analysis and assessment to decide that understanding gun ownership and preventing firearm suicide was the part of the conversation where we could add value and we could start, given that the vast majority of gun deaths are suicides every year, even though there are lots of other misuse of firearms that ruins lives. That's the place we're starting. The group is meeting proactively. They've now met a few times. We're having a really rich discussion. There are strong gun rights advocates in the stakeholder group. There are strong leaders in the gun violence sort of prevention world, and a number of really interesting people that are public health experts, that are practicing doctors, that are mental health professionals. There are people with specializations around key populations like veterans, LGBT youth, that have sort of higher risk factors at play. And we are now pivoting into more of a discussion about solutions. So the dialogue has done a lot of sort of foundation setting and shared learning and building some connective ties. And now we're really going to be getting into the hard discussions about what are the programmatic and policy interventions we could possibly pursue as a group that would help bring down the number of firearm suicides. As folks probably know, suicide in the US has been rising really over 20 years. This is a long-term problem. The numbers are going in the wrong direction. And there's been a particular spike in isolation, which can contribute to ideation and suicide attempts during the pandemic, because a lot of people are experiencing both social and economic isolation. So there's actually a real urgency to this question, even though it's a longer term challenge in the country. And of course, around half of suicides use a firearm as the method. So we'll report back more later as that group gets a little bit further down the field, but I just wanted to reassure everybody that project is ongoing. I'm really encouraged by it. There have been some very inspiring and difficult moments. And even after the sort of very hard to watch a mob attack of the Capitol a few weeks ago, the group has since met. And although that was not the focus of our dialogue or our discussion, some of the people in the group shared that they called each other and talked it out. And we're like, what am I watching? What is going on? Help me understand this, because I know you're from a different perspective than me. And so we were gratified that our dialogue has been able to build enough relationships and connective tissue that even during very difficult, hard to understand moments, people in the group are seeking each other out as a sounding board, which is exactly the kind of relationship that we want to build in our convergence projects as we move towards solutions. So with that, I will wrap up my portion on these programmatic updates. I know there were other hands up and other comments in the chat. I promise we will read them all, and the staff will collect those to make sure we get to see them after the conversation. And I'll hand it back over to our leader for the meeting, Amanda Brown.
Thank you, Russell. That was fantastic. And thank you all. What an amazing, rich conversation. I feel a little breathless myself, sort of running into the finish line here. But we had some amazing conversations about connecting our work with the current moment, about one of our most incredibly important and timely dialogues just now. For anyone who needs to leave at this point, we're sharing the meeting evaluation in the chat, and we really ask that you take a few minutes to fill it out. It does help us plan future meetings. And while this concludes the substantive portion of our program, we're now going to transition into some structured networking time. So imagine that this is the point, if it was a live LC meeting, when you might stand up and stretch your legs, which you should feel free to do if you'd like, and when you might strike up a conversation, an informal chat with a few others in the room. So Doozy is going to help us do that right now. Doozy, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Just to say that today marks Convergence's third virtual leadership council meeting and over a year since the last in-person Convergence gathering. We've been so heartened by the resilience of the Convergence community in transitioning to online meetings and in the enthusiasm that you demonstrate for spending time with us, even over Zoom. That said, as Amanda mentioned, I know that we all miss the opportunities we once had to gather by the coffee pot or to have a glass of wine after engaging in substantive discussions about our work, to connect with Convergence friends or introduce ourselves to the new people in the room. So for the next 20 to 25 minutes, we're going to spend some time in breakout rooms actually networking and getting to know one another. In each breakout room, a member of Convergence's staff or board will be ready to host the session, and they'll have some connecting questions at the ready to prompt your conversations. So we're going to put you in breakout rooms and then bring you back to end the meeting. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. Let me invite you each to share a word in the chat or a brief reflection about how you're feeling after participating in today's discussion. That'll be informal feedback we appreciate, but we're also again sharing the evaluation in the chat, which is our formal evaluation that we really look closely at, and just want to thank you in advance for filling that out. I want to thank everybody on the Convergence team. This event is an absolutely all hands on deck. Every staff person, every intern has been with us this afternoon, and working in the background to make sure that this program went as smoothly as possible. A special thank you to Erica, Angela, Doozy, Jag, Jen, all of you that were making this work as well as it can. So we really appreciate your being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you again to Jessica for getting us going, and to all of our guest speakers.
And to you, Amanda, thank you for taking us through this.
Absolutely. All right, we'll see you soon. We'll give a minute for people to keep chatting their comments, and we'll close the room in just a minute.
Thank you.